Today we're beginning a new series called Take Up Your Cross and Follow Me. Now in our day, taking up a cross is probably quite a bit different than it was in Jesus' day. In his day and age of martyrdom, taking up your cross literally meant being crucified. But in our day, especially in the United States, or if you live in an industrialized country, a democracy, you're probably not going to face any real punishment in that way for your faith. But there are other crosses that we bear as Christians that are easy to neglect. There is a cross to bear in something like loving your enemies. There's a cross to bear in generosity. Mercy is a cross. Humility is a cross. Not getting credit for things is a cross. That there's these ways that Jesus teaches us to live our life, but that on the other side of that crucifixion is resurrection. That there's a great reward for that. And I don't just mean going to heaven or gold when you get to heaven or something like that. I mean that it leads to the kind of life that is just overflowing with joy. Overflowing with joy. And so we're going to talk about that going on. But first we have to understand how horrible, ugly, repulsive, and disgusting the image of the cross was and is. That the cross today is actually amazing that Christians and Christ himself took the image of the cross and by what he accomplished on that cross turned it into something beautiful, the most recognized religious symbol in the world today. But it wasn't that way in the first century. Author Tom Holland talks about the first heated pool that was built on the Equiline Hill just outside the city of ancient Rome. It was about 3 or 4 decades before the birth of Christ, and nobody knew that someday this terrible place would be one of the richest, most beautiful places in Rome. Here behind me you can see one of those famous baths. Before the buildings were built there, outside the Equiline Gate, there was a place called the Caesarium, where people were crucified. And not just any people. Romans didn't execute thieves or murderers with crucifixion. Crucifixion was reserved for one type of person and one type of person alone: a rebellious slave. It was during these times in the Caesarium that you might see children, women, old people dying over periods of days, being kept alive to be tortured to death in this horrible way by the Roman Empire. Crucifixion meant that the person was either nailed or tied to a cross. Before they were crucified, the victim would be stripped of all of their clothing, including their underwear. They would be beaten almost to the point of shock, whipped, and hung, and then put on display on a main road so everyone could see this is what happens to slaves when they rebel against their masters. My point in saying this, what a great way to start a sermon, huh? Just so bright and cheery. Why am I talking about this? The reason is that eventually this mode of execution makes its way to Israel. And those who are in Israel, some of them zealots, some of them, by this time, the practice becomes that any insurrectionist, that is any rebel, anyone who is a part of conquered Rome, if they try and rise up, well, they get crucified as well. And by Jesus' day, you have seen many of your friends, usually young men, crucified on the road into Jerusalem or crucified into Caesarea or one of the towns that you lived in. When Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, he's talking about a very ugly instrument. He's talking about the worst way anyone could have imagined in those days dying, in something that probably most people had witnessed. In fact, they wanted everybody to see it. That was the point. The great thing, though, about the cross is that the cross is the thing that comes before the resurrection. And that with such a great price also comes such a great reward. Maybe many of you right now today you're watching and you are going through a cross. You're going through a horrible time in your life and you don't know how you're going to get through. But remember, we don't serve a Christ who is still on the cross. We serve a Christ who is raised from the dead. And when we follow him to the cross, we also follow him to the resurrection. He won't let you go to the grave with him without raising you from the dead. Wherever he goes, we go. Yeah, he goes to the grave, we go with him, but when he rises, we rise with him. And I want you to know you're going to get through whatever you're going through. You are going to get through what you're going through. You and Christ together, I promise you. And that brings us to Matthew chapter 16. We talked about this 2 months ago, about his brief visit to Caesarea Philippi, where the famous line, "Take up your cross and follow me," is uttered, but it's uttered in a crazy context. Remember, Jesus has his disciples, and most of these disciples are young, very conservative Jewish teens or guys in their 20s. Jesus takes these 12 disciples from the area of Galilee. He takes them up to a region called Caesarea Philippi. It is the Vatican for Pan worship. Pan is one of the key gods in the Greek pantheon. He's half goat, half man, god of fertility, and all of the other stuff that goes with that. And there was regular worship in Caesarea Philippi. The whole space was just effectively a worship center for the god Pan. If you go to Israel, you can see this today, that there's 2 spots that are very famous. One is called the Gates of Hades, and the other is called the Rock of the Gods, okay? So this image here on the left, this is the Rock of the Gods, where all of the pagan statues were. The biggest one was set aside for the idol Pan. And this area on the right, which is just actually to the left of this, you almost want to switch them. This is called the Gates of Hades. Hades is a dark, damp, shadowy place of the dead. And it's like Jesus doesn't even say anything yet. He looks at his disciples and he says, "Who do people say I am?" And they're like, with one eye they don't want to look, and the other eye they do want to look, and then they look at Jesus. And Peter, being the oldest, has to respond. And he looks at Jesus and he says, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist, come back. And some people say you're Elijah, and other people think you're Jeremiah." And Jesus looks at him and says, "Who do you say I am?" And with boldness, Peter says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus says this phrase that is the greatest compliment any rabbi can give to a disciple. It's a very common thing to say, and it's when they give the best answer they could possibly give. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by your Father in heaven." And then he adds this bit, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Literally, he's looking at the Rock of the Gods and the gates of Hades. I mean, they're looking at it as he says this. Maybe it's on this rock that he will build my church. In other words, I want you to go into the world and build my church here. And he says to Peter, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so it's this great compliment. And then Jesus looks at them and he says, "I need to tell you guys something else. I'm going to go to Jerusalem very soon. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law are going to put me to death. But on the 3rd day, I will be raised to life." Do you remember who speaks again? It's Peter. Again, what does Peter say? "Never, Lord. May this thing never happen to you." That seems like a very caring thing to say, doesn't it? It's like a mother who says to a soldier that wants to enlist in the army during a wartime, "Don't do it. Be safe. Stay at home." Right? It seems like a caring thing. What does Jesus say? "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling rock to me." Notice how he goes from the rock on which he will build his church to a stumbling rock. "For you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Why does Jesus say this? Well, I know you've heard me say this a million times, but just a brief review. A disciple is not just a follower or a student. A talmid in Hebrew, is this person who, when a rabbi comes to them and says, "Follow me," and they accept, they are essentially enrolling in the idea that they're going to do everything the rabbi does. So, everything Jesus does, Peter does. When Jesus walks on water, what does Peter do? He walks on water. You do what your rabbi does. When Jesus goes to Jerusalem, what does Peter have to do? When Jesus dies on the cross, what does Peter have to do? See, when Peter says this, I think It's feigned concern for Jesus, but it's really concern for himself. And this is revealed in the fact that not that long after this, he's going to deny Christ 3 times. In response to this, when he says, "Never, Lord, don't go to Jerusalem," Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't care about the things of God. You only care about your life. You only care about the world." And then Mark says that he turns to the whole crowd and in a loud voice shouts to everyone, including his disciples, "Whoever," this is a rabbi, right? Full of passion, this is not weird. This is how rabbis are. This is why people follow him. Full of passion, full of fight, full of vinegar. "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross," and there's the word, "and follow me." Do what I do. "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be if you gain the whole world but forfeit your soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" And you can almost picture Jesus' voice echoing off of the wall of the Rock of the Gods and echoing off of the gates of Hades and piercing the hearts of people as God in flesh calls them all to mass repentance and to the cross. Did they stop and look? Maybe. I don't know. I don't think Jesus screaming at an audience is an easy thing to ignore. When Jesus is screaming this in front of Peter, who said, "Never, Lord, never," he says that anyone who goes to the cross in this way will not fail to inherit a great reward. Being with Christ is always the best place to be. But if you want to follow Christ to heaven, first you have to follow him to the grave. And this is the bizarre dichotomy of what it means to be Christian, of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Yes, we want the reward of full, rich life, of joy, of happiness, of love, of heaven, of a great church, of a great community, but there's also a great cost. And that cost, by the way, is a big cost, but it's different for everybody. And I want you to know that if you pay that price, you will receive that reward. There is always, always, always going to be a social cost of discipleship. If you have not experienced a social cost in your discipleship, it might be that something's wrong. Remember what Jesus said. "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you." Why? Because that's what they did to the prophets. It means you're doing something right. "But cursed are you when everybody only says good stuff about you all the time. It's all good stuff." Why? Because that's what they said about the false prophets. Maybe you've experienced that before. I remember when I was in high school, I was 16 years old, and I had this group of friends. And we played basketball together all the time, and they were not bad kids. They weren't great kids, but we were all just a bunch of dudes playing basketball after school every day, and these are my only friends. I was living in a new place, and this is all I had, and these are nice guys, but we used a lot of language, and we talked about dumb stuff all the time, and I remember I had this radical miracle experience and conversion experience where after that, I kept hanging out with these guys, but I could just sort of slowly feel us growing apart. I didn't think their jokes were funny anymore. I liked basketball, but the company it's like it didn't feel right. And over time, I'm not judging them. They weren't bad. I wasn't like some righteous thing, but just something was happening in my life that made it where it didn't fit anymore. And eventually there was a season where I stopped playing basketball with them, and we stayed acquaintances and friends, and it was all good, but I just had this season of loneliness where I had no friends. And I wanted the Lord with all my heart, but I also felt this loneliness. And a temptation sometimes is to go back to those old groups maybe where you don't belong, you don't fit because you feel lonely. Don't do that if that's you right now, by the way. Very often in those seasons, God's preparing your life for new friends that are going to get you to the place you need to go, to get you to your destiny. And it's going to be so full of joy, so full of resurrection life and power. And actually, in this case, after months of loneliness, I eventually found a youth group called 180 where I would meet a number of friends, but one of the closest ones was a guy named Chris Presley, who was the older brother to Hannah Presley, who is now named Hannah Schuller. Hi, Hannah. My wife. In fact, I'm going to see Chris Presley later today. We're going to be playing cards. And I think about how God prepared my heart for that friendship and for my friendship with Hannah, that 30 years later is going on full of life and full of joy. And that's why Jesus says, his disciples from John the Baptist come to Jesus and they say, Rabbi, because John the Baptist was very stern. He was an SE, they're kind of like monks, and they're very strict. And so his disciples come to Jesus and they say, Rabbi, how come your disciples don't fast? And Jesus looks at them, and the Greek says, because they're stoked. They're happy people. It's the most obvious answer ever. He says to them, when you're with the bridegroom at the wedding, you don't fast. They're happy. And then he says, you don't take new cloth and put it on an old garment, because when you wash it, it'll tear the cloth. And you don't take new wine. Okay, wine is just a rich, awesome symbol in Judaism, and it should be for Christianity. You don't take new wine and put it in an old wineskin, or else what? The wineskin will burst. Wine is universally a symbol for joy, celebration, friendship. Remember that Jesus' first miracle was that he turned water into wine at the end of a wedding. And remember what the host said to him? One, this is amazing wine. This is like the best wine I've ever had in my life. He says to Jesus, normally people, or maybe Jesus says it, I can't remember. But no, he says to Jesus, normally you serve the best wine at the beginning, and then when everybody gets drunk, you bring out all the cheap stuff. But he says, but no, you have saved the best for last. That's the kind of God we serve. I think the enemy front loads the good stuff and back loads the bad stuff. But God front loads the cross and back loads the resurrection. Right now, maybe you're going through difficulties in your work or marriage or family. I want you to know we serve the kind of God who saves the best for last. Amen.